I remember the first time I set foot on this land. The soil was hard, unforgiving, cracked like the back of an old leather boot that had seen too many seasons. My grandfather had left me this 100-acre plot in his will, along with a rusty tractor and debts that seemed to multiply like weeds after rain. Everyone in town said I was crazy to try farming it. "That land's been cursed," they whispered behind weathered hands. "Nothing good ever grows there." But I had something they didn't understand: hope mixed with stubborn determination. I spent my first year just clearing the rocks, some as big as automobiles, hauling them away with my bare hands, and that ancient tractor that coughed black smoke like a dying dragon. My neighbors watched from their porches, shaking their heads, waiting for me to give up and sell to the developers who circled like vultures. The second year, I planted my first crop of corn. The seeds went into that reluctant earth like prayers into silence. I watered them with sweat and hope, checking the rows every morning before sunrise, whispering encouragements to tiny green shoots that pushed through the soil with the determination of soldiers advancing through enemy territory. When harvest came, I had enough corn to fill 3 storage bins. Not much by industrial standards, but for a man starting with nothing but dreams and determination, it felt like striking gold. I reinvested every penny back into the land, buying better seeds, repairing equipment, slowly nursing that stubborn soil back to life. The land was teaching me patience, and I was learning to listen. By the 5th year, my farm had transformed into something beautiful. The soil that once cracked and resisted now yielded to the plow like an old friend welcoming an embrace. My corn stood tall and golden, swaying in the wind like a sea of prosperity. I had expanded to soybeans and wheat, rotating crops the way my grandfather had taught me in stories told around winter fires. I built a new barn with my own hands, timber by timber, nail by nail. Each board was placed with care, each joint fitted with precision born from years of learning to make do with what you have. The red paint gleamed in the morning sun, and I felt a pride that money couldn't buy. This wasn't just a building. It was proof that dreams could take physical form if you were willing to sweat for them. The farmhouse came next. I tore down the old shack that grandfather had left me and built something worthy of the land it sat on. White clappered siding, green shutters that I painted myself on Sunday afternoons, a wraparound porch where I could sit with my coffee and watch the sunrise paint the fields in shades of gold and amber. Margaret started coming around then. She was the librarian in town, quiet and kind, with eyes that saw the beauty in simple things. She'd bring me books about sustainable farming and stay for dinner, helping me plan crop rotations over plates of fried chicken and mashed potatoes. We talked about the future, maybe children running through these same fields, maybe growing old together on that porch I'd built with such hope. Thomas Crane owned the property adjacent to mine, a sprawling estate that had been in his family for 3 generations. Where I had built something from nothing, he had inherited everything: money, land, and the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having to work for what you have. He was tall and broad, with hands that had never been cracked by honest labor, and a smile that never reached his eyes. From the beginning, Crane made it clear he didn't appreciate having a dirt farmer as a neighbor. He complained to the county about my irrigation system, claiming it was lowering his property values. He filed noise complaints about my tractor, even though I was careful to work only during reasonable hours. When those tactics failed to drive me away, he tried to buy me out, offering insulting sums that wouldn't have covered the cost of my barn, let alone the blood and sweat I'd invested in every acre. His offers came with thinly veiled threats wrapped in expensive lawyer's language. He spoke of eminent domain, of zoning changes, of environmental concerns that could shut down my operation. Each conversation ended the same way, with Crane's cold eyes promising that one way or another my land would become his. I politely declined each offer, but I could see the calculations running behind his gaze, measuring my weaknesses like a predator sizing up prey. The harassment escalated slowly. My irrigation lines were cut in the middle of the night. Equipment went missing from my barn. Crops nearest his property line were trampled by unknown vandals. They installed security cameras, but they were mysteriously disabled or destroyed. The sheriff, who happened to be Crane's poker buddy, always found reasons why no charges could be filed. I should have seen it coming, but I was too focused on the present to recognize the storm gathering on the horizon. Crane's real plan was far more sophisticated than simple harassment. While I was busy farming and building my future, he was manipulating the system, pulling strings I didn't even know existed. It started with a property survey that I didn't order. Official-looking men in hard hats appeared at my fence line with equipment, claiming they were conducting routine boundary verification for the county. I didn't think much of it. Bureaucracy was always generating paperwork for its own sake. They spent 3 days measuring and taking notes, occasionally glancing toward my fields with expressions I couldn't read. 2 weeks later, Margaret burst into my kitchen with tears in her eyes and a legal document clutched in her trembling hands. The county had received an anonymous complaint about improper land usage and unpaid taxes dating back decades. According to the paperwork, my grandfather had never properly transferred ownership, and the land had technically belonged to the county all along. Worse still, there were supposedly thousands of dollars in back taxes owed, compounding interest over 20 years. The document was thick with legal jargon, but the meaning was crystal clear. I had 30 days to pay $47,000 in back taxes and penalties, or the land would be sold at public auction to recover the debt. $47,000 might as well have been $1 million. Every penny I'd earned had been reinvested into the farm. My bank account held barely enough to cover next month's seed purchases. I knew immediately who was behind this. Crane's fingerprints were all over the timing, the convenient discovery of decades-old tax issues, the impossible sum demanded. But knowledge and proof are different animals entirely, and I had no way to prove what I knew in my bones to be true. The auction was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, when the leaves were turning colors that reminded me of flames. I spent those 30 days fighting like a drowning man, calling lawyers I couldn't afford, researching property law until my eyes burned, frantically trying to secure loans that banks wouldn't give to a man about to lose everything. Margaret stood by me through it all, using her connections at the library to help research precedents, making calls to legal aid societies, holding me when the weight of impending loss made it hard to breathe. We both knew it was futile. The system had been weaponized against me by someone with deeper pockets and better connections, but we fought anyway because surrender felt like betrayal of everything I'd built. The morning of the auction arrived grey and cold, with a wind that cut through jackets and chilled souls. A small crowd gathered on the courthouse steps, curious townspeople, a few legitimate bidders, and Thomas Crane wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly income. He nodded to me with mock sympathy, his eyes already calculating how quickly he could tear down my barn and expand his estate. The auctioneer's voice carried across the autumn air like a death sentence. 100 acres of prime agricultural land, improvements included, minimum bid set at $47,000 to cover outstanding taxes and fees. Crane raised his hand immediately, confident in his orchestrated victory. A few other hands went up, but as the bidding climbed towards $60,000, they dropped away one by one. Crane won my life's work for $73,000. A fraction of what the land was worth, but more than anyone else could afford on such short notice. He shook hands with the auctioneer like they were old friends, signed papers with a gold pen, and became the legal owner of everything I'd spent 15 years building. I watched my dreams transfer ownership in a matter of minutes, reduced to signatures on documents and entries in ledgers. The eviction notice came 3 days later, delivered by a sheriff who couldn't meet my eyes as he handed me the papers. I had 2 weeks to remove all personal belongings and vacate the premises. 2 weeks to dismantle a life, to pack up 15 years of memories and hopes into boxes that would fit in the back of my pickup truck. I moved slowly through the house I'd built, touching walls I'd raised with my own hands, looking out windows I'd installed with care and precision. Every room held ghosts of the future I'd planned. Children's laughter that would never echo down these halls. Christmas mornings that would never happen. Quiet evenings with Margaret that had been stolen along with everything else. Margaret helped me pack, her usual optimism strained but not broken. She spoke of new beginnings, of opportunities waiting in other places, of love being stronger than property lines. But I could see the grief in her eyes, the way she touched familiar objects like she was saying goodbye to old friends. This house had been our shared dream, even if the papers had only ever carried my name. The hardest part was walking through the fields one last time. The autumn corn stood ready for harvest, golden ears heavy with the promise of another successful season. But I wouldn't be there to bring in this crop. It would fill Crane's storage bins, add to his wealth, become part of the empire he'd built on theft and legal manipulation. My sweat had prepared this harvest for another man's profit. On my last night in the house, I sat on the porch I'd built and watched the sun set over land that was no longer mine. Crane's security team had already installed new locks and posted no trespassing signs along the fence line. In the distance, I could see lights in his mansion, probably celebrating his latest acquisition with expensive wine and self-congratulation. I rented a small apartment above the hardware store in town, a cramped space that smelled of dust and broken dreams. Margaret's apartment wasn't much bigger, but we spent most evenings together, planning our next move like generals plotting a campaign they couldn't afford to lose. The options were limited: start over somewhere else with nothing, or find work as a hired hand on someone else's farm, trading ownership for wages and security for dependency. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't wake up to roosters crowing and sunrise painting my fields gold. Instead, I woke to traffic sounds and the hiss of coffee makers in the diner below my window. I found work at Henderson's farm, 20 miles out of town, driving equipment I'd once owned, working land that would never belong to me, earning a fraction of what my own harvest had once provided. Henderson was a good man who paid fair wages and didn't ask too many questions about why I'd ended up working for someone else. But every day was a reminder of what I'd lost: the independence, the pride of ownership, the simple satisfaction of walking your own land in the early morning quiet. I was still farming, but as a hired hand rather than a steward of my own small corner of the earth. Margaret found work at the regional library system, a promotion that should have been cause for celebration, but felt hollow given everything we'd lost. We talked about marriage, about building a new life together, but the conversations always circled back to the injustice of what had been stolen from us. The wound was too fresh, the anger too raw, for us to pretend that moving on would be simple or quick. Crane, meanwhile, expanded his operations onto my former land with unseemly haste. He tore down my barn and built a larger one, painted corporate blue instead of the honest red I'd chosen. He installed industrial irrigation systems and brought in migrant workers to handle the harvest. The personal touch that had made my farm special was erased as efficiently as footprints in snow. Working for Henderson taught me things I hadn't learned in 15 years of independent farming. He'd survived boom and bust cycles, drought and flood, market crashes and political upheavals that had destroyed other operations. Over lunch breaks and long truck rides to distant fields, he shared hard-won wisdom about the business of agriculture. Farming's not just about growing crops anymore, Henderson explained one afternoon as we watched combines harvesting soybeans. It's about understanding markets, managing risk, knowing which politicians to support and which regulations to fight. The family farmer who just wants to work his land and mind his own business, that's a dying breed. He told me about commodity futures, about the complex financial instruments that could protect a farm from price fluctuations or destroy it with leveraged speculation. He explained how agricultural subsidies really worked, how environmental regulations could be used as weapons by competitors, how land use planning committees made decisions that affected individual farmers without those farmers having any real voice in the process. Most importantly, Henderson taught me about the networks that really controlled agricultural policy in our county. It wasn't the farmers who made the decisions. It was the bankers who held mortgages, the lawyers who navigated regulations, the politicians who wrote the rules, and the wealthy landowners who had the connections and capital to influence all of them. Men like Thomas Crane didn't just own land. They owned the system that decided how land could be used. This education was painful but necessary. I'd been fighting Crane's theft with tools he'd already neutralized: legal appeals, moral arguments, public opinion. He'd won because he understood the game I hadn't even known we were playing. If I ever wanted justice, I'd need to learn his rules and find ways to use them against him. I began spending my evenings at the library, not to visit Margaret, but to research Thomas Crane's business empire. What I discovered was more complex and more vulnerable than I'd imagined. His wealth wasn't just inherited, it was actively managed through a web of corporations, partnerships, and investment vehicles that stretched far beyond our little county. Crane's agricultural holdings were just one piece of a larger puzzle that included real estate development, banking investments, and political contributions to candidates at every level of government. He sat on the boards of 3 banks, owned shares in the largest agricultural supply company in the region, and had been a major contributor to the current county commissioner's campaign fund. But complex financial structures created complex vulnerabilities. The more I learned about Crane's operations, the more I understood how he'd stolen my land, and the more I saw opportunities to use his own methods against him. He'd won through patience, planning, and systematic exploitation of legal and financial systems. There was no reason those same tools couldn't be turned in the opposite direction. Margaret became my research partner, using her library access and investigative skills to dig deeper into public records, property transfers, and corporate filings. We worked like archaeologists, excavating a buried city, carefully documenting connections and relationships that painted a picture of systematic corruption and manipulation. The breakthrough came when Margaret discovered that Crane's agricultural expansion had been financed through a federal rural development loan program designed to help beginning farmers. The irony was bitter. He'd used taxpayer money intended to support people like me to fund the theft of my land. But more importantly, the loan came with conditions and reporting requirements that he might not be meeting. Federal agricultural loans require detailed documentation of how funds are used, environmental impact assessments, and proof that projects serve the intended purpose of supporting rural economic development. Crane's application, which Margaret obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, painted a picture of his expansion as beneficial to the local farming community and committed to sustainable agricultural practices. The reality was different. Crane had used the loan money to purchase industrial equipment that eliminated jobs rather than creating them. His conversion of my small-scale sustainable operation into an industrial monoculture was exactly the opposite of what the loan program was designed to support. Most damning of all, he'd failed to file required annual reports documenting his compliance with loan conditions. I documented everything with the methodical patience that farming had taught me. Photos of the destroyed barn, employment records showing reduced local hiring, soil samples indicating the environmental impact of his industrial farming methods. Margaret helped me navigate the bureaucratic maze of proper complaint procedures, ensuring that every form was filled out correctly and every deadline met. The complaint triggered an investigation by the USDA's Inspector General's office, but investigations move slowly through bureaucratic channels. In the meantime, I continued working for Henderson and learning more about the vulnerabilities in Crane's empire. His success had made him careless, confident that his connections would protect him from consequences. That confidence became his weakness. Crane continued expanding his operations, taking on more debt, making larger political contributions, and treating regulations as suggestions rather than requirements. Every violation was documented, every missed filing noted, every environmental shortcut photographed and catalogued. I was building a case brick by brick, the same way I'd once built my barn. The USDA investigation expanded when their auditors discovered that Crane's loan violations were just the beginning. His agricultural operation was connected to a network of shell companies that had been used to circumvent environmental regulations, evade taxes, and manipulate commodity markets. What had started as a simple case of loan fraud grew into a federal investigation involving multiple agencies. I watched from a distance as investigators descended on Crane's properties like locusts on a field. They seized records, interviewed employees, and conducted soil and water tests that revealed contamination from illegal pesticide applications. The man who had stolen my land through legal manipulation was being destroyed by the same system he'd exploited. The irony wasn't lost on me. Crane had taught me that the law was just another tool to be used by those who understood how to wield it. He'd shown me that justice wasn't about right and wrong, but about who could navigate complex systems more effectively. Now those lessons were being applied against him with methodical precision. Margaret and I watched the investigation unfold like spectators at a slow-motion demolition. Criminal charges were filed first: fraud, tax evasion, environmental violations. Then came the civil penalties, asset freezes, and court orders that froze Crane's ability to operate his businesses. The empire he'd built over decades began crumbling under the weight of systematic illegality. The local newspaper covered the story with the enthusiasm of journalists who'd finally found a villain worthy of their attention. Crane's political connections evaporated overnight as politicians distanced themselves from a man who'd become a liability. The same banker friends who'd helped orchestrate my land's theft now refused to return his phone calls. Crane's trial lasted 3 weeks and ended with convictions on 14 federal charges. The judge's sentencing statement mentioned the particular cruelty of using government programs designed to help family farmers to destroy family farming operations. He received 12 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $2. $3 million in restitution to various victims, including the Rural Development Loan Program he'd defrauded. But the criminal conviction was just the beginning of Crane's downfall. The asset forfeiture proceedings that followed the trial were designed to recover stolen money and ill-gotten gains. Everything connected to his criminal enterprise, including the land he'd stolen from me, was subject to seizure and sale to pay restitution to his victims. The irony was perfect. The same legal mechanisms Crane had used to steal my property were now being used to take his. Federal marshals posted seizure notices on the gates of his estate, just as the sheriff had once posted eviction notices on my farmhouse door. The man who'd shown no mercy was now begging for compassion from a system that had none to give. I attended every hearing, watching justice grind forward with the inexorable patience of a combine moving through a wheat field. Margaret sat beside me, squeezing my hand during the moments when the magnitude of our victory threatened to overwhelm us both. We'd spent 3 years building this case, and now we were watching it deliver everything we'd hoped for. The asset sale included not just my original land, but Crane's entire agricultural operation. Equipment, storage facilities, even the industrial barn he'd built to replace the one I'd constructed with my own hands. The federal government's need to recover stolen money created an opportunity to reclaim not just my property, but to build something even larger and more successful than what had been taken. The asset auction was held on a Tuesday morning in spring, when the fields were green with new growth and possibility hung in the air like morning mist. I stood on the courthouse steps where I'd once watched my dreams being sold to the highest bidder, but this time I was holding the winning bid instead of watching helplessly from the sidelines. Henderson had partnered with me to form a corporation capable of purchasing Crane's entire agricultural operation. The 3 years I'd worked for him had been an extended job interview, and he'd seen enough to trust me with managing a farming operation 5 times larger than what I'd originally lost. The student had become the partner, and together we were building something that would have been impossible for either of us alone. Margaret and I were married the following month in a ceremony held in the same barn where Crane had once stored his stolen harvests. The white clapboard farmhouse I'd rebuilt was larger than the original, with enough room for the children we were planning and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides instead of just the front. Everything was better than before, larger, stronger, built on foundations that wouldn't be so easily shaken. The farm operation now covered over 500 acres and employed 12 full-time workers, providing the kind of rural economic development that Crane had only pretended to support. We'd implemented sustainable farming practices that improved soil health while increasing productivity, proving that profitability and environmental responsibility weren't mutually exclusive. But the real victory wasn't measured in acres or profit margins. It was the satisfaction of watching the sun rise over land that truly belonged to me, of knowing that patience and persistence could triumph over wealth and corruption, of understanding that sometimes the best revenge is simply outlasting your enemies and building something better from the ruins of their greed. Thank you so much for listening to this story of resilience, justice, and the power of never giving up on what's rightfully yours. I hope it reminded you that even when the odds seem impossible, persistence and careful planning can overcome the most powerful adversaries. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales of triumph over adversity. Your support means everything to creators like me who believe in the power of storytelling to inspire and entertain. Until next time, remember that every ending is also a beginning, and sometimes losing everything is just the first step toward gaining something even better.